Growing up in a Hispanic household meant a few things. My house constantly smelled like Fabuloso, in particular the purple one. Telemundo was always playing on the TV. Instead of taking regular medicine, my family thought an egg would cure my sickness. And 9 times out of 10, if there was music playing, it was salsa music. If you grew up listening to salsa music like me, you probably recognize this song. If you guessed La Vida es un Carnaval by Celia Cruz, you're right. It's off her 1998 album, Mi Vida es Cantar. My name is April, and today we're going to talk about the life of Celia Cruz, how she gained the title of Queen of Salsa, and most importantly, how she paved the way for other Afro-Latina artists. On October 21st, 1925, Catalina Alfonso and Simón Cruz gave birth to their first daughter, Ursula Hilaria Celia de la Caridad Cruz Alfonso. Cruz was born and raised in Havana, Cuba, and she grew up in the neighborhood of Santos Suarez. According to Celia's mom, at only 10 months old, Celia began to sing. As Celia Cruz continued to grow up, her passion for music would continue to grow as well. She would sing in school productions and in local community gatherings, and once she actually became a teenager, her tia and her cousins would take her to cabarets to perform. After graduating high school in the late 1940s, Celia Cruz began participating in radio competitions and performances. It wasn't until she competed on the amateur radio show La Hora del Té where she won a singing competition. And it was then where producers and musicians started to take notice of Celia Cruz and her immense talent. In 1948, Havana Pan Art Records released 3 records titled Toque de Santo. They were the first known recordings featuring Celia's vocals. 2 years later is when Celia Cruz's career really began to take off, when in June of 1950, she auditioned to be the new lead singer for the famous Afro-Cuban orchestra Sonora Matancera. Not only did this propel Celia's career, but she had already began to make history. She was the group's first black woman to sing for the orchestra. Fast forward to 1960, Celia Cruz and La Sonora Matancera are touring Mexico. And at this point, Celia Cruz has already made a name for herself, and she's pretty well known throughout Central and Latin America. While Celia was touring Mexico, the Cuban Revolution had just ended, and President Fulgencio Batista's regime was overthrown and replaced by a new Cuban government led by Fidel Castro. During this time, both Celia Cruz and La Sonora Matancera publicly renounced Castro's socialist regime during their tour, refusing to bow down to Castro's new dictatorship. And as a result of this, Celia Cruz was actually exiled from Cuba. Following the Mexico tour in 1961, Celia Cruz and La Sonora Matancera make their way to the United States. And even though Celia was performing as the lead singer of the orchestra, she began to do solo gigs in Los Angeles. In 1962, Celia Cruz decides to move to New York with her newlywed husband, Pedro Knight, who was actually a trumpeter for La Sonora Matancera. New York was actually an ideal place for Celia to relocate, considering that at the time, the Latin scene was booming. After performing with La Sonora Matancera for almost 15 years, Pedro and Celia decide that it's time to part their ways, and at that time, Pedro also decides that he wants to manage Celia Cruz. In 1966, Latino jazz musician Tito Puente reaches out to Celia Cruz in hopes to collaborate with her. Together, they released Cuba y Puerto Rico Son under Puente's label, Tico Records. Under Tico Records, they also released an album titled Son con Guanguanco, which was the first album to promote Celia Cruz as a solo artist. At this point in Celia's musical career, she had been experimenting with different sounds and styles in her music. She was known for her performances of Latin pop music and guaguanco music, but she still hadn't discovered her love for salsa yet. In 1974, Tico Records gets taken over by Fania Records, which at the time was the lead salsa recording label. That same year, Celia Cruz recorded her first album under Fania Records in collaboration with Johnny Pacheco. The album Celia and Johnny was born, along with one of her most famous hits, Quimbar. This album was Celia Cruz's first salsa album, where she incorporated different elements of guaracha, mambo, Latin jazz, and rumba. And she would go on to collaborate with different artists such as Roy Barreto, P. El Conde Rodriguez, and Willie Colon Orchestra. I would also like to mention that at this time, Celia Cruz was the only female artist under Fania Records and quickly became one of the few women to succeed in the male-dominated salsa world. For 60 years, Celia Cruz performed in hundreds of venues and concerts. She went on to record over 80 albums and songs, earned 23 gold records, 5 Grammy Awards, amongst other achievements. At 77 years old, Celia Cruz passed away from battling brain cancer. She died on July 16, 2003, and 13 days later, on July 29th, she released her final album, Regalo de Alma. Despite her success in the music industry and being named the Queen of Salsa, Celia Cruz still had to overcome adversity as an Afro-Cuban woman. She broke barriers of race and gender in her music. Her vocals, which fell in a contra-alto range, was less common in female vocalists. She was criticized for her looks, for not being conventionally attractive and following beauty standards. She was told her skin was too dark, her nose was too big, and her voice was too deep. Even though Celia Cruz was exiled from her home country, she didn't let that stop her from embracing her Cuban culture and spreading positive messages throughout her music. One of her most famous catchphrases in her music is azúcar, which means sugar. Celia Cruz would use this word as an interjection in her music in remembrance of the enslaved Africans who worked on Cuban sugar plantations. She understood just how powerful her voice was, not only for singing, but for using it to convey important messages and bring her audience together.